John Banks was a very sensible and grounded man, and I say that because I knew him. He was a pillar of the local community when I was growing up in my village, and if you went to his house, you would never find outside the door a saucer of honey-sweetened milk. Now, you may be questioning, why would you find a saucer of honey-sweetened milk outside anyone's door? Well, you would be thinking that because you live in the southeast of England. And we in the southeast, because this is a story of Kent, which is as far southeast as you can go, really, we in the southeast have sort of lost touch with quite a lot of our folklore. So you were talking, Chris, about the fair folk. I am not going to use the F word, because if you use the F word, the danger is they'll come. But in the West Country, people understand the fair folk in the north of England, in Wales and Ireland, they understand the fair folk. But in the southeast, we've forgotten. And John Banks was a very sensible man, a very grounded man. So he would never think of putting out a saucer of honey-sweetened milk. And that in itself could be enough to irritate one of the fair folk. But the thing I haven't mentioned is that John Banks was also the captain of the bell tower for the church. Now, when I was growing up, there were two sets of youth events or youth activities in my village. One was ringing the church bells, one was singing in the church choir. I did both. And John Banks was the captain of the tower. So not only was he not leaving out a saucer of honey-sweetened milk, he was also in charge of ringing church bells. And if there's one thing that the fair folk can't stand, apart from being ignored by not being given saucers of honey milk, it is the bells of churches. So he was a double irritant. And this is a story of the fair folk, and as far as I have found so far, it is the only Kentish fair folk story. And at the end of the story, I'm going to check to see if you can spot which member of the fair folk this story is about. And I will give you a clue before we continue. The clue is Wednesday was Shakespeare's birthday. Right. So John Banks had finished the bell practice. All those of us learning to ring the bells had gone home, and he was left to lock up the tower, having made sure that all the ropes were hung and knotted appropriately and safely, and the lights were turned off. And so he locked the tower with a great iron key and slung it into his tweed jacket pocket. And off he went down Church Road. We're talking villages, we're talking places without lots of street lights. And Church Road, you came out of the church, you turned right, you went down Church Road, which then swung round to the left to go down to the main road towards Ashton. But it was a summer's evening, a beautiful summer's evening, with a beautiful summer's moon in the sky. There was enough light to see for him to choose not to go that way. But instead of going round to the left, down towards the road to Ashford, he would go along the track that ran parallel to the North Downs, parallel to the Pilgrim's Way. And so he set off down the track in the shadow of the North Downs. And as he was walking, he noticed, I mean, we're talking England here. You know, we talk about summer, but we really don't know what summer means, do we? And summer temperatures can climb quite quickly. So he was walking along and he suddenly felt quite chilly on this summer's evening. And he noticed that it was getting darker. And as he walked, he looked up at the moon and clouds were bubbling over the moon. And he knew that it was soon going to start to, it started to rain. It started with a gentle pitter-patter on the leather patches on his shoulders of his tweed jacket. But soon it was coming down in stair-rods and pouring down his face and down the back of his neck. He looked for shelter and he saw a tree. Not many trees on this track. Fields either side of the track, but not many trees. But he saw a tree, and as he ran towards the tree, turning his collar up, he heard a giggling sound. But he reached the tree and he stood under the tree, grateful for the shelter of its branches and its leaves from the worst of the weather. But as he stood there, he heard a voice that seemed to come from the tree. And this is what the tree said, and this is a joining in. So you repeat after me. Up and down, I will lead him up and down. Up and down, I will lead him up and down. In field and town, I will lead him up and down. All in field and town, I will lead him up and down. And then John Banks suddenly felt the rain on his hair again and pouring down his face. And he looked up, and there were no branches and no leaves. He looked behind him, and the trunk had gone. There was no tree. And he was sure he had stood there under the shelter of, but he looked further on the track. And in the dim moonlight, the remainder of the moonlight left from the clouds that were almost covering it completely, he saw there was a tree that looked very similar to the one he had been standing under, a bit further up, about another 30 yards ahead. So he ran as quickly as he could to get to that tree. And he eventually reached the tree and stood under it and was grateful for the leaves and the branches to give him some shelter from the rain that was really coming down in torrents and splashing up of mud, covering the bottom of his trousers, covering his very expensive leather shoes. But as he stood there in the shelter of the tree, he heard, up and down, I will lead him up and down, up and down, I will lead him up and down. Goblin feared in field and town, I will lead him up and down. Goblin feared in field and town, I will lead him up and down. You know, he was getting wet again, and the mud was splashing up, and the tree was gone. He turned around and he saw about 30 yards down the tree, and looked remarkably like the one that he'd been standing under. And so he trudged his way through the mud, sploshing and slushing and screeching and splushing his way through the mud until he reached the tree and stood under it. No second passed before he heard that voice once more saying, up and down, I will lead him up and down, up and down, I will lead him up and down. Goblin feared in field and town, I will lead him up and down. Goblin feared in field and town, I will lead him up and down. Well, this went on, but he didn't know how many hours. He had no idea how far he'd gone up that track running parallel with the North Downs and the Pilgrim Way. But as he go, every time he went up to a tree and stood in its shelter, every time he thought he was safe from the torrential rain, he had heard the same thing, up and down, I will lead him up and down, I will lead him up and down. Golden feared and field and town, I will lead him up and down. Golden feared and field and town, I will lead him up. And at every point the trees had disappeared until eventually he had reached the tree again, just as the rain began to ease. And he stood under the tree and breathed a sigh of relief. But as he breathed a sigh of relief, he leant back on the trunk of the tree to hear a voice say, it's jolly cold out here. I'm going somewhere nice and warm. And the tree disappeared and he fell flat. His wife, Edith, was as straightforward as Jack Banks was. I'm not sure what time he got home, but I suspect he had a lot of explaining to do. Why he was covered in mud, soaked to the skin, his tweed jacket had to be wrung out, his beautiful leather shoes were ruined, and any babbling about the tree that kept disappearing and a voice that kept coming out of the tree about a goblin feared in field and town, she would have had none of it. However, this evening is about new beginnings. And Jack, or John Banks, had a new beginning of his relationship with the world of the fair folk. Because if you visited his house ever after that, there would always be a saucer of honey-sweetened milk, just in case. Name the fairy? Okay, you've just been reciting some Shakespeare. You've been reciting a little Midsummer Night's Dream just to celebrate Shakespeare's birthday. But that is the story of the Travelling Tree, a 17th century story from Kent, and that was how you and I told it.
And all new beginnings must eventually come to an end, and that brings us to the end of our wonderful evening of storytelling. So thank you for being our wonderful audience and our wonderful set of tellers. Next month, we are having John Rowe here. John is the founder, I believe, Alison might correct me on this, of the World Storytelling Cafe based out in Morocco. And fortunately, he's also got a connection with Worcester Park, which is very inconvenient for us. So he's coming to share some tales from his travel, tales from the road, and of course, we'll have more stories from the floor in the first half. But as usual, once we're all done, you can move your chairs over there and stack them up. If all the storytellers could go and sign their name and the name of their story in the book for the record, that would be wonderful. And we'll hopefully see you all next month. Thank you.